Chapter 1. Samantha moaned as his lips brushed hers and his tongue moved into her mouth to tangle with hers. His hand smoothed down her body. She had never felt so good. Her hands roamed over his back, lightly grazing him with her nails. He pulled his head back for a second and she got a glimpse of his face. Of course. He was always there. Her dream lover. Doorbell. Samantha groaned and covered her head with her pillow. Why would someone be ringing her doorbell at this god-awful hour? She peeked out and looked at the alarm clock. Oh crap. 7:30. Luke never let her sleep past 6:30. She jumped out of bed running to the door in her tiny sleep shorts and thin sleep tank. She flung open the front door, not thinking about what she wore, only caring about being late. She was never late for anything. Luke was Samantha's 6-year-old son. Her husband died when he was 3, and she'd been a single parent ever since. She was a kindergarten teacher, and for the past year, she had watched Luke's best friend, Connor, before and after school and during school holidays. Now that it was summer break, she was watching him. It actually made it easier for her, because it gave Luke something to do and someone to do it with. I'm sorry. Luke must have overslept for the first time in his life. She opened the storm door for Connor, trying her best not to make eye contact with his dad, the ultra-sexy single dad, Nick Boston. Samantha's eyes opened wide as she realized, for the first time, that the man who had been invading her dreams for the past year was Nick. Sure, he was sexy, but the fact that he was the man she'd been dreaming about embarrassed her to no end. She'd never seen him so soon after waking before, and that must be why she'd never connected him with her dream lover. Nick leaned against her door jamb in his business suit with a huge grin on his face. I like your jammies. Samantha flushed. I'm sorry. She stepped behind the door. I never set an alarm, because I've never needed to. Luke has been my alarm clock since the day he was born. Nick laughed. I'm glad he forgot to set himself last night. I'm seeing a whole new Mrs. Whitney. She felt her face turning redder. And a whole lot more of Mrs. Whitney than you were ever meant to see. She took a deep calming breath, brushing her long blonde hair over her shoulder and out of her eyes. She hated dealing with people before her first cup of morning coffee. I promised the boys we'd go to Six Flags today, so if you need to reach us, call my cell. Well, if you're going to be out all day, it's going to be a lot harder for you to plan dinner. Why don't you let me take you and Luke out to eat tonight? Connor has been dying to go to a fun little burger joint not far from here and take Luke with him. Samantha sighed. She'd been turning Nick down for the year that she'd known him. She knew that a hot guy like him was only asking her on pity dates because the boys were good friends. Her marriage had left her in no question as to her sexuality. She was a great female friend, but when it came to sex, she was a dud. Nick, I'd be happy to watch Connor while you go out on a date tonight. You don't have to saddle yourself with Luke and me. Nick's eyes widened. Saddle myself? You're joking, right? You're one of the sexiest women I know. You're also one of my son's favorite people. There's no one I'd rather spend my Friday night with. Let's go out. I promise we'll show you and Luke a good time. Nick wanted to shout at her. She was the sexiest woman he knew, and he'd been trying to ask her out for a year. Eventually, she was going to say yes if it killed them both. She stared into his brown eyes, knowing she was about to drown. He had to be the sexiest man in the state of Texas. How could she keep saying no to him? All right, but just this once. I'm sure the boys will be thrilled. They never get enough of each other. Wow. I can't wait to tell the boys at the office that I have a date with Mrs. Whitney. I've been telling them how sexy you are since Connor's first day of kindergarten. He winked at her as he backed out and strode to his truck. He told himself he'd take it slowly. Very slowly. He could tell it was what she needed. She must have loved her husband very much. She stared after him. That man had the nicest butt she'd ever seen. She shut her eyes. What was she thinking? She couldn't date him. She couldn't date anyone. She was Samantha Whitney, and she was a sexual dud. Her marriage had been a disaster. She'd married her best friend straight out of college. She still wasn't very clear on why. They both had been single halfway through their senior year, and he'd said, "We should get married. I'm sick of dating stupid women." She'd looked up from her lesson plans for student teaching to where he was sprawled on the couch in the apartment she shared with 3 other girls. Uh-huh. Sure. Whatever you say, Jake. He'd grinned. Okay, I'll call the moms tomorrow and tell them. Okay, Jake. She forced her mind away from what she'd be teaching the children the next day. I thought you came here to study. I need to get these lesson plans done. Their mothers had been best friends since they met at a park when the 2 of them were babies. They had taken swimming lessons together and learned to ride bikes together. They had gone to their prom together, because neither had been dating anyone else at the time. They were each other's fallback for everything, but there was nothing but friendship between them. He didn't say anything else about getting married until he was leaving to go back to his dorm room that night. So, what do you think? A June wedding? I can get the moms started on it right away. She laughed and kissed his cheek. Sure, Jake. You do that. She'd been so sure he was joking. It was after midnight, and she needed sleep. She hadn't needed his nonsense. She hadn't given him another thought. The following afternoon, her phone had rung as she'd walked in the door from teaching all day. Hello? I'm so happy for you, Sam, her mother had squealed in her ear. She'd held the phone from her ear and stared at it for a minute. Thanks? What was she talking about? We reserved the church for the 1st and 3rd Saturday in June until you pick the date, and Jake's mom is working on finding a reception hall. Now, I know Jake said June, but do you have a day picked yet, honey? I'm assuming you want a Saturday wedding, so I have the church holding both the 1st and 3rd Saturdays because they have them both available, but they can only hold them for a little while. Do you have a preference? Samantha's head started to spin. Her life was spiraling out of control. Samantha stood in stunned silence for a moment with the phone to her ear. I need to talk to Jake and get back to you, Mom. Okay, dear, but the church will only hold those days until the end of business tomorrow. June is a big wedding month. I understand. I'll call Jake now. And give him a piece of my mind. And a piece of my baseball bat. I really am happy for you, Sammy. It was always our dream to see you married to Jake. I didn't think you two were leaning in that direction, but I'm so glad you've surprised us. She took a deep breath. I'll get back to you right after I talk to Jake, Mom. I promise. Love you, honey. Love you, too, Mom. I'm not looking forward to the conversation after you find out the truth. Holy crap. What is he thinking? She wondered. She grabbed the phone and dialed Jake's number. What are you trying to do? My mom thinks we're really engaged. She's working on reserving a church. She could almost hear Jake grin. I know. You said you'd marry me just last night. Remember? This is a cruel joke to play on the moms. They've wanted this since we were toddlers. Before we were toddlers. What are you thinking? Her voice was almost a wail. If she'd been talking to anyone but Jake, she'd have been embarrassed, but he knew her better than anyone, so it just didn't matter. He sighed heavily. I'm not playing a joke, Sam. I really do want to marry you. Why do you want to marry me? We've never even kissed. We've never dated. Are you insane? The last word was all but shouted. Her roommate emerged from her room, and she shook her head at her to indicate she was okay. Look, let me come over, and we'll talk. Yeah, whatever. Hurry, though. I have lesson plans to write and papers to grade. I have a paper to write. This is a tough semester for me. She paused. You're going to have to be the one to call both moms and tell them you were lying, you know. I know. I'll be there in a minute. I'll even bring a pizza. Pepperoni, black olives, and extra cheese. She smiled. Don't forget the dash. Little cheese packets, he finished for her. He'd always been able to finish her sentences. He was like her favorite pair of warm-ups. Comfortable. But the thought of sex with him was just weird. Why would he want to marry her? Yeah. She hung up the phone and pulled out her backpack, getting to work while she waited. 30 minutes later, he was there with the pizza and cheese and a Diet Pepsi for her. I noticed you were almost out last night. Thanks, she said absently as she grabbed it and unscrewed the lid. Now, what on earth are you thinking? He opened the pizza box and grabbed 2 paper plates out of her cabinet. He knew where everything was kept because he spent half of his time there. He served them each 2 pieces of pizza and plopped down on the couch. Okay, here's the deal. I just broke up with Brenda the Brainless. We dated for 2 years. Yeah. I know all that. She was an idiot and you never should have gone out with her to begin with, which I told you when you met her. What does that have to do with you telling the moms you're marrying me? He took a bite of his pizza, chewing it slowly while he watched her. Well, you just got dumped by Tim the Terrible. How long were you guys together? 6 months? Yeah, 6 rotten months with Tim the Terrible. We both date losers. So? He took a swig of his Pepsi. So, I know you're not a loser, and you know I'm not a loser. So we set each other up with friends. We don't tell our mothers we're getting married. Her voice sounded almost panicked. How was she going to explain to her mother that Jake had been joking? She couldn't get the happiness in her mom's voice out of her head. She'd never heard her sound so excited. I think we really should get married, Sammy. I like you. I can talk to you. That's a better foundation than so many marriages have. Most people get married because they want to have sex. When the sex gets old, the marriage falls apart. We'll get married knowing that we're best friends. We can talk to each other. I love you. I will always love you. Even when you're old and wrinkled, I'll still love you because you're my best friend. She gulped down some of her drink. So you don't think that sexual attraction matters at all? I don't want a sexless marriage. At least she didn't think she did. Did she want sex? According to her other friends she did, and a lot of it. He shook his head. You're still a virgin, right? Yeah, you know I am. Well, let me tell you, sex is no big deal. We'll have sex, but we'll still be best friends, you know? She shook her head. You're nuts. What about that moment when you know that you're in love? What about the magical feeling of being touched by someone who makes your blood sing? I'm not nuts. And you've read too many romance novels. That stuff doesn't really happen. She could never clearly remember how, but sometime in the next hour, he'd convinced her. She'd called her mother and given her the date for the wedding. She'd gone shopping and picked out a dress. And she'd married Jake. That was 10 years ago. She wouldn't go back for anything. If she hadn't married Jake, then she wouldn't have Luke. She shook her head, forcing herself back to the present, and looked down at Connor. Why don't you go wake Luke up while I get a shower? Yes, ma'am. She stopped off in the kitchen on her way to the bathroom and started the coffee. It would be ready by the time she was out of the shower, which was good. Those boys should not have to deal with her pre-coffee self. She headed to the back of the house where the master bath was. Why had she agreed to go out with Nick? Sure, he was hotter than a Texas summer. That man made her drool, just thinking about him. She knew next to nothing about him, though. He was a single dad, and he was a great father to Connor. He had a housekeeper named Mrs. Patterson. She didn't even know what had happened to Connor's mother. She'd asked once and had been told politely, "I'm a single father." Nothing more. She hadn't dated at all since Jake had died. There just hadn't seemed to be a point. She had a young son. He was the entire focus of her world. Trying to date, and finding someone to babysit regularly, would have been too chaotic. Her mom, and Jake's, lived 3 hours away, which was probably for the best. After graduation, they'd stayed in Arlington where they'd both gone to school. Their home was in White Oak, a small town not far from Longview. They were always happy to take Jake for a while, but it was just too far to drive. Besides, she just plain liked having him with her. She stripped and got into the shower, washing quickly. She couldn't take her mind off the way Nick looked at her. Jake had always treated her like an old well-worn pair of shoes. She was comfortable to have around, but nothing to get excited about. The look Nick gave her made her think that he definitely thought she was someone to get excited about. She let herself daydream as she washed her hair. What would it be like to kiss him? She wondered. She felt like a teenager getting ready for her first date. Of course, that first date would include 2 6-year-old boys, which was going to be interesting. Did she even really want a first date with him? Honestly? She dressed in shorts and a tank top and went out to find both boys sitting on the floor, watching the Disney Channel. They had a couple of hours yet before Six Flags opened, so she'd let them watch TV while she got breakfast ready. "You boys want pancakes?" she called. "Yes, please," Connor answered. "Mickey Mouse ones," Luke answered. "Is there another kind?" she called back to the living room. She pulled out the mix and quickly stirred it while downing her first cup of coffee. She poured out the first of the pancakes and started on her second cup. By the time she was sitting with her own plate of pancakes and her third cup of coffee, she felt moderately human. She tried to do Six Flags at least once a week through the summer with the boys. They would go for a few hours as soon as they opened, and then leave as soon as the crowds got heavy. It was right there in town, and with their passes, it was a cheap way to pass a summer morning. The day passed quickly with her usual chores. After Six Flags, she made lunch, and then gave the boys some light schoolwork just to keep their minds in the game through the summer. They played in the backyard all afternoon while she cleaned house and paid bills. She called the boys in to wash their faces and change at 5:30. That would give them plenty of time to get dressed and horse around. What should take 10 minutes always seemed to take an hour when they were together. She kept extra clothes on hand for Connor in case he and his dad needed to go out after work. She went to her room to change clothes at 6, knowing that Nick would be there between 6:15 and 6:30. She wasn't going to do much, since it was just a date with the kids along, but she really needed to wear something better than shorts and a tank top. She found some jeans and a short-sleeve shirt and pulled them on. She pulled her long hair back and added some lipstick. She didn't wear much makeup and wasn't about to change that even for Nick. She was just coming out of her room when the doorbell rang. The boys had collapsed in front of the TV again. She opened the door and invited him in. He smiled as he saw the boys sitting on the floor. "Are you ready to go?" he asked. "Yeah." She gave each of the boys an assessing look. They'd dressed and washed their hands and faces. She really couldn't ask for more. "We're going to need to take my minivan. I have car seats for both of them." He shook his head. "We'll transfer a car seat. I'm not riding in a minivan. The car seats are built in. They can't be transferred." She handed him her keys. The boy's safety is more important than your machismo, and I'll let you drive. You don't have to worry about riding in a minivan. You can drive one. He glared down at the keys. You want me to drive a minivan? Are you serious? She took the keys back, rolling her eyes. I'll drive. Or Luke and I can follow you. I don't care either way. She couldn't believe he was making an issue out of her van. It was safer for the boys than his pickup truck, and that was all that mattered. You can always go without us, too, but my son is not riding without a car seat. He snatched the keys back from her. I'm kidding. Sort of. It's just such a mom car. She sighed heavily, pointing her thumb at her chest. I'm a mom. A mom car seemed logical. She loved her minivan. It was perfect for hauling groceries and kids, and had 2 extra car seats built in. It was perfect for her and Luke. She didn't care what he said. You're a beautiful, sexy mom. You should be driving a sports car, he said with a grin. Sexy? Her? That would be so practical for lugging a kid and groceries around, don't you think? No, I think I'll keep my van. She herded the kids out the door, and they automatically got into their car seats. They were used to riding in her van, no matter how much he complained about it. SUVs can be sexy. I don't need a sexy vehicle. She snapped her seat belt into place and watched him adjust the driver's seat for his long legs. I need a functional vehicle for my son and me. This is perfect for us. He backed out of her driveway and headed in the direction of the restaurant. It was a small one that she'd seen several times, but she didn't like to go out to eat with just Luke. It was easier to just stay home most of the time. The 5-minute drive to the restaurant was filled with the boys' chatter from the back seat. Connor was excitedly telling Luke about the great video games at the restaurant. They even have skee-ball. Wow, I love skee-ball. I'm good at skee-ball. I'm gonna kick your butt. Nick stifled a laugh. Samantha grinned over at him. She forgot that he'd never really spent time with the 2 boys together. She'd been Connor's kindergarten teacher and had the boys for hours together 5 days a week for a year now. They'd hooked up when he'd placed an ad the previous year for someone to watch his son for the summer and take him to and from elementary school during the school year. She hadn't been looking for a job, but she'd thought it would be good for Luke, and she'd been right. They had a lot of fun together. I bet I can kick your butt at skee-ball, too, she said softly. He laughed. I bet you can. I'll be too busy watching yours to pay any attention to my game at all. She blushed. I looked this place up online, and it looks like fun. I'm sure the boys will have a blast. Now that you've finally agreed to go out with me, I'm sure I'll have a blast, too. He pulled the van into a parking space. Everybody out of this silly mom car. The boys giggled and unbuckled themselves, getting out the sliding doors. She unbuckled and took Connor's hand, because he'd been sitting behind her. Her heart melted a little bit when she walked around the front of the van and saw her little boy clinging to Nick's hand. He needed a daddy. She knew that Nick was a good one. It was too bad that this was just a one-time thing. She would have liked to keep him around. For Luke's sake, of course. Only for Luke. They walked into the restaurant and were seated. The boys took one side of the booth, and she slid into the other with Nick. He was wearing a short-sleeved button-up shirt, but had taken off his tie somewhere along the way. She knew he had an office job somewhere, but didn't know much else about what he did. Okay, my rule here is we decide what we want, and then play $5 worth of games. Then we can play lots of games after we eat, Nick told the boys. I know, Dad, Connor said. Don't be rude. Luke didn't know. Yes, sir, Connor answered. They all studied their menus. The boys quickly picked what they wanted and told the adults, receiving their dollars for tokens. They scrambled off and left Samantha and Nick alone. "Are you sure we shouldn't go with them?" she asked. "Connor knows not to go where I can't see him. We have a good view of them." He pointed in the direction of where the boys were playing a game of skee-ball. "We'll order our food. After we're done eating, we'll all go play together." "Okay. Sounds like a well-used system." He grinned. "We come here at least once a week. I like to be able to take him places that we both enjoy, and this is a good compromise. They serve adult food, and there are no giant cartoon characters running around." She laughed. "I tend to just go places where they like to go and give up my identity as an adult. I'm just a mom. Not a person in my own right." She was surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. With the sexual tension between them, she'd thought it would be much harder. He turned toward her on the booth. "I sure don't see you as just a mom. I see you as a person in your own right. An incredible person. A person I want to get to know better. You don't have to say things like that to me. I really do enjoy having Connor around." She looked away from his eyes. What was it about those eyes of his that turned her into a puddle of mush? His brows drew together in a frown. "What does one have to do with the other?" She sighed. "You really don't have to butter me up or pretend to be attracted to me just to get me to keep watching Connor. It's the best situation all around. Luke is better behaved with Connor there. He gives him something to do." He stared at her in disbelief. "You honestly think that I've been asking you out for the past year to get you to keep watching my kid for me? If I was worried you'd stop watching him, I'd offer you more money, not ask you out." Why did this woman not realize how incredible she was? She tilted her head to the side, thinking about that for a minute. "That makes sense. I've been asking you out because I think you're sexy and you seem to genuinely care about my son. That's the kind of woman I want in my life. And in my bed," he added silently. She shrugged. "Your son is easy to care about. And I know I'm not sexy. I have only ever been in your living room. Do you have mirrors in your house?" "Of course, I have mirrors in my house." She gave him a confused look. "Well, then you should know how sexy you are. What happened to make you think you're not a desirable woman?" The waitress stopped at their table to take their orders. Without thinking, Samantha ordered for herself and both boys. After Nick had placed his order, he turned back to her. Well, what?" she asked, trying to stall. "What happened to you? Why are you so convinced that you aren't worth my time?" She shrugged, staring down at the napkin in her hands. "Nothing." His eyes scanned the restaurant for the boys, and then he turned back to her. "Samantha, something has happened. You can't make me believe that a woman who looks as good as you do always felt like she is unworthy of a man's desire." She laughed. "You sound like something from a bad romance novel." "Unworthy of a man's desire?" He laughed, too. "Okay, you have a point. And I'll drop it. For now. Not forever, though. I'm not interested in you as my son's teacher, or as a potential mom for him. I'm interested in you as a potential lover for me." She swallowed hard. The drinks came then, which broke the tension she'd been feeling. She was glad. He was making her very nervous. The boys came back to the table and pounced on their drinks, talking about their skee-ball game. She felt a lot more comfortable once the boys were back, but she was still very aware of Nick. Every time their arms brushed or she heard his deep rumbly voice, she shivered a little. She'd never been this aware of a man before. She'd certainly never been this aware of Jake. After they'd eaten, they all played in the games area. She and Luke challenged Nick and Connor to a rousing game of foosball. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed so much. She really hadn't realized how much she'd missed male companionship. Even in settings like this. She had a close female friend that she did a lot of things with, but she hadn't had a male that she'd spent any time at all with since Jake. The drive home was quiet. The boys were tired and had gotten all their jabbering out of their systems. They pulled up in front of her house, and he picked up a sleeping Connor and transferred him to his car seat in his truck. She unfastened Luke and started to pick him up to carry him inside. "I'll get him." She started to argue, but Luke was heavy, and she was thrilled to not have to do everything herself for once. She moved aside and led the way to Luke's room so Nick could put him in his bed. She took his shoes off and tucked him in. She didn't bother with undressing him. He was in shorts anyway, and it wouldn't kill him to sleep in his clothes for one night. She quietly walked out of his room and closed his door, walking Nick out to the front. He took her hand and pulled her out next to his truck. "Sorry, I want to be able to see Connor, but I want to talk for another minute or two without little ears around." She laughed. "We do seem to always have little ears around." He reached out and brushed his fingers softly along the side of her cheek. "I want a relationship with you. A relationship that has nothing to do with those boys of ours." She stared up at him. "I just don't think that's a good idea." "I wish it were." It was dark, but for the low beams of the streetlights and the front porch light she'd turned on before they left. She couldn't see his face well, but she had it memorized. He was the sexiest man she'd ever known. She'd always thought that he should have been in movies, not in Texas raising a kid. "How about if we try an experiment?" "What kind of experiment?" she asked warily. "I get to kiss you. Just once. If you don't like it, or I don't like it, I back off, and never ask you out again. If we both like it, then we spend some more time together. With the boys and without the boys, but mostly with. I don't think we should do a lot of dating without them." He wanted to see how they all fit together as a family as well. He didn't just want her in his bed. He wanted her in his life forever. She tilted her head to the side for a moment, considering his idea. It was probably for the best. Once he'd kissed her, he'd know that there was no way he wanted a relationship with her, and that would be the end of it. "Okay, I can go for that." He grinned and took a step closer to her. She could see his brown eyes reflected in the streetlight. He moved his hand behind her head, under her hair, and pulled her toward him. She stood on tiptoes and pressed herself against him. She was willing to give this kiss all she had, since it was the only one they'd ever share. As soon as his lips met hers, she felt a spark shoot through her body. She'd heard girls talk about feeling that way in high school and college and never believed that it was possible. Now she believed. She really believed. He traced the seam of her lips with his tongue. She moaned against his mouth and opened for him, welcoming him inside. Their tongues danced together in a ritual as old as time. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him closer. Why had kissing Jake never felt this way? He turned her until her back was pressed against his truck and his leg was inserted between hers. One of his hands stayed at the back of her neck, while the other remained at the side of her waist, but she'd never felt anything as intimate in her life as that kiss. It was like she'd been sleeping her entire life and now she was awake, and she wanted this man, and she wanted him now. Yesterday. All she could think about was dragging him inside and to her bed. But his little boy slept a few feet from them inside his truck, and her baby was in the house. She drew back from the kiss. "Holy cow. What did you just do to me?" she whispered. He chuckled deeply. "I was going to ask you the same question." Wow. She'd always considered herself an educated, articulate woman, but all she could think to say was, wow. "I get that date now, don't I?" he asked with a grin. He'd better get that date. He wanted her more than ever after that kiss. She nodded. "I think you've earned it." She was in a daze. What had he done to her? Tomorrow? I don't know if I can find a babysitter that fast. I've never really had one for Luke before. She was stalling. She knew she was. She just wasn't sure if she was ready to be alone with him. How about this? Why don't y'all come over to our house and go swimming? We'll do a cookout and all of us can hang out together. We'll go out by ourselves another time. I'd like to see how we all work together anyway. I don't want a quick relationship. Those boys love each other. Connor thinks of you as a mother figure. I'm looking at this as long term if we can all get along well. Her eyes widened. That's moving way too fast for me. Let's take this one cookout at a time, okay? He grinned. That works. Connor and I will go to the store in the morning and get another car seat, because we're not going anywhere else in your mom mobile, and then we'll swing by and pick you two up. Why don't we say around 10? We'll provide all the food. You just need to bring yourselves and your swimsuits. When she dreamed of him that night, his kisses were so much more real to her. She woke herself up twisting in the sheets. Why couldn't she have dreamt about someone untouchable? Like a movie star or someone? Chapter 2. Luke was in her bed at 6 the following morning, snuggling close to her under her covers. Mom, why did I sleep in my shorts instead of my jammies? Samantha's mind was pure mush, and she had to work to think. She was not the morning person her little boy was, and never had been. You fell asleep in the van on the way home last night. Connor's dad carried you in and put you in your bed. I like Mr. Nick. I think you should marry him so Connor and I can be brothers. Samantha's eyes opened wide at that. It's not that simple, Luke. Connor's dad doesn't love me. You can't marry someone without loving them. She stroked his cheek and covered him up more snugly as she said the words. Luke scrunched up his little face like he was thinking hard. How do you know he doesn't love you? Did he tell you? 'Cause I think he does. He gave you the goo-goo-eyed look that Alexis gave me right before she showed me her panties at recess. Samantha tried to hide her grin. In kindergarten, showing a boy your panties was the ultimate declaration of love. Well, goo-goo-eyed look or no, he doesn't know me well enough to love me. You have to know a person to love them. Luke thought about that. Well, do you love him? She sighed. I don't know him well enough to love him either. Samantha hated this part about being a single parent. She would love to tell him to go talk to his dad right about now. Well, then y'all need to get to know each other better. How about we all go to Six Flags together or something? Yeah, because Six Flags was a great place to really get to know someone. She smiled. We're going to their house to swim today. How would that be? And we're going to have a cookout. She almost covered her head as she waited for the explosion of excitement. Really? You mean it? I've never been to Connor's house. He was up zipping around the room. What should I take? I know I need my swim trunks, but would I be a sissy if I took my flow-a-tie? I sometimes like to just float around in my flow-a-tie. She laughed. No, I don't think that would make you a sissy. Why don't you go get your flow-a-tie and your swim trunks together, and I'll get my shower and then make breakfast. We'll just do cereal this morning, because I think that Mr. Nick has a feast planned for lunch. She thought about her conversation with Luke while she showered. He didn't so much want a dad as he wanted a brother. She hadn't really thought much about dating, but maybe it was time. When Nick knocked on the door a few hours later, she was wearing shorts and a tank top with her bathing suit on underneath. She had Luke in his swim trunks and a t-shirt. She had packed undergarments for herself and shorts and underwear for Luke to wear home. She also had towels for them both and a flow-a-tie for Luke. Luke bounced to the door excitedly. Hi, Mr. Nick. I've never been to your house, and I'm really excited. He was bouncing up and down on the balls of his feet as he talked to him. Nick grinned. I'm really excited, too. I thought we could make burgers and hot dogs and swim. How does that sound? It sounds great. I'm already wearing my swim trunks. I see that. Why don't you go get in the truck with Connor, and I'll help your mom lock up? He cast a look at Samantha that made her think he had a lot more than just locking up on his mind. Luke looked at him like he was deranged. My mom doesn't need any help locking up, because she's been doing it for a long time, but I'll go get in the truck with Connor. He ran out to the truck to join his friend. Samantha grinned at Nick. Luke's right. I don't need help locking up. I'm really good at it. Everyone has skills, and that's one of mine. She had her keys in her hand and dangled them for him, showing him she even knew what tools to use to lock a door. He looked back over his shoulder to be sure that Luke was out of sight and pulled her close. I just had to get this out of the way without any little eyeballs watching. He lowered his head and kissed her quickly, his lips toying with hers. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back. She'd almost been able to convince herself in the light of day that their kiss last night had been nothing out of the ordinary. Now that he was kissing her again, she had to face facts. She was not a sexual dud. She wanted this man with every fiber of her being. She broke off the kiss and stood staring up at him, breathing heavily. We can't do that in front of the boys. Luke already had ideas about them being in love, but she wasn't about to tell him that. He rested his forehead against hers. I know. That's why I waited until Luke was in the truck. He paused as if searching for the right words. When are you going to let me take you out? Just the two of us? On a real date? I haven't dated since my husband died. How long ago was that? He couldn't believe that they'd never talked about that before. He knew that it had been at least a year, because he'd known her that long, but how much longer, he had no clue. 3 years. And she still missed her best friend every single day. She didn't miss her husband, though. Why haven't you dated in 3 years? He asked. Are you still missing your husband that much? His voice was sympathetic. She laughed. He was my friend. I miss my friend. That's all. I haven't dated because I don't feel I have anything to really offer in a relationship, and because I've had a child to raise. I don't feel like I should leave him while I go off with some man. Nick looked at her questioningly. There's more there than you're telling me. He could see on her face that she was hiding something, and it was something important. She shrugged. We have to go. The boys are waiting in a hot truck. She pulled away from him and waited for him to leave so she could lock the door. She knew she'd have to discuss her disaster of a marriage with him if they were going to have a relationship. She did know that, but would telling him about it making him realize just how worthless she was as a woman? His house was only a few blocks from hers, but they were very important blocks. The neighborhood Nick and Connor lived in was much nicer than her own. The houses were bigger and the lawns were manicured as opposed to simply mowed. He pulled up into the driveway of a large 2-story brick home and stopped the truck. Both boys unbuckled and jumped out yelling about being the first in the pool. Samantha followed the boys and waited while Nick unlocked the door and led them through the house to the kitchen where he put some groceries onto the counter. I'm just going to put the food in the fridge, and we'll cook about noon. Will that work for you? The kitchen was huge. It was honestly her dream kitchen. All of the appliances were stainless steel and it was immaculate. She knew he had a housekeeper who came in 3 days per week who even cooked for them, so that was probably why it was so clean. She could see herself cooking there with no problem. Sounds perfect. I can supervise the boys while you cook, or we can all get out and cook together. However you want to handle it. He smiled. You boys ready to hit the pool? He asked. The boys hooped and ran toward the back door. They had the door open and their shirts off, before Samantha was halfway there. She followed them out the back and watched as they both did cannonballs into the pool. She'd taken them both to swim lessons the previous summer and knew they were strong swimmers, so she didn't worry too much, but she still watched them carefully. She stripped off her shorts and tank top right there at the edge of the pool, casually putting them over the back of one of the loungers. Her swimsuit was a purple two-piece. While not overly revealing, it did nothing to hide her generous curves. Nick had finished putting everything away, and stepped outside just as she was getting into the pool, by way of the steps on the shallow end. His eyes followed her into the water, watching her closely. She could feel his eyes on her, but tried not to let her nervousness show. She'd been married for 5 years. It wasn't like she was a high school girl with her first boyfriend. And she'd dated regularly in college. No, she hadn't slept around, but she'd certainly been around men before. She'd just never felt about one the way she felt about Nick. Nick pulled his shirt over his head and followed Samantha down the steps and into the water. The boys were racing back and forth across the pool, laughing and shouting. He couldn't help but smile as he watched his son with his friend. He'd known they were close, but watching them together made him think of how close he was to his twin brother, Jack. They'd been inseparable. He'd always felt somewhat guilty for not providing Connor with a brother close to his own age. Maybe he'd found a solution with Samantha and Luke. He slowly sneaked up behind Samantha and caught her around the waist. "So, boys, should I duck her?" Luke and Connor both looked at him wide-eyed for a second. Connor started cheering, "Yeah, Dad, duck her." Luke seemed unsure for a moment. It was his mom, and he was supposed to protect her, right? But Connor seemed so excited. "Yeah, duck her, Mr. Nick." "Hey! No fair ganging up on me," she shouted as he forced her under the water. She took a huge gulp of air as she went under. When she came out sputtering, she grabbed Nick by the shoulders and tried to force him under, but he was too strong. "Help me, boys." Both boys were there in an instant, grabbing him and trying to force him under. She wrapped one leg around his and pulled his legs out from under him, watching him sink with both boys still attached. She laughed as he came up for air. They all played around dunking each other, with the boys laughing uproariously. Neither of the boys had ever really seen her that playful before. She'd always had to be the serious grown-up, and it was fun for her to finally get to play around and share the responsibility. After a while, she went over to sit on the steps of the pool, and Nick followed, while the boys went off to practice jumping into the pool. Nick grasped her hand under the water and grinned at her. "Are you having fun?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm having a blast, and more importantly, Luke is having fun." "So what should we do tomorrow?" he asked. She smiled. "The boys are going to start thinking that we'll do something together every day. I don't think it's a good idea to make them get too excited about that." He sighed. "Why not? I'm very interested in you. I want our relationship to move fast. Hell, I'd ask you to marry me right now if I thought you'd say yes." He watched her face carefully as he said that. He had been thinking marriage since the day he met her, but was pretty sure it was too soon for her. Her jaw dropped. "Marriage? You've got to be kidding me. I thought you were just looking for someone to hang out with. Or something." Really, she didn't know what she thought he wanted. He shook his head. Just how dense was this woman? "Look, I don't play around with my kid's emotions. He loves you, and he loves your son. I wouldn't do anything to make him believe that there was a possibility that we could be a big happy family if I didn't think we were headed in that direction." She stared at him. "You're serious, aren't you?" She couldn't believe this. Why did men always seem to talk about marriage in weird ways with her? He squeezed her hand. "While the boys are occupied, maybe you should tell me about your husband. You said he was your friend." And you said you feel like you have nothing to offer in a relationship. Talk to me about that. She stared out at the boys. Maybe just getting it out of the way was the best way for both of them, and then he would move on, and she could go back to her boring life. She really didn't want to talk about it, and had only told one person the full story, but if they were going to have a relationship, then he had a right to know upfront what he was getting into. Jake's mom and my mom were best friends. They met while pushing our strollers in the park and became walking buddies, trying to lose their baby weight. They're still best friends. Their greatest wish in life was that Jake and I would get married one day. Jake was your husband? Yes, I'm sorry. Jake was my husband. We grew up practically in each other's pockets. Our dads were friends. Every day until we started school, we were at each other's house. Every evening. Every weekend. I honestly thought it was normal to have family dinners with someone else's family every night. She paused, giving Luke a thumbs-up sign when he made a spectacular splash with a cannonball. We were friends. We were best friends. He was my prom date because we were both between relationships. We went to a lot of things together. He was my fallback date for everything. We went off to college together. She paused for a minute. Did you start dating in college? He asked. No. We didn't. We were still just best friends. I dated other people. He dated this one spectacularly stupid girl. I called her Brenda the Brainless. They dated forever. I dated a bunch of guys, but never got serious about any of them. Anyway, about halfway through our senior year, he got this bright idea that we should get married. I was in the middle of doing lesson plans, and I thought he was joking, so I agreed, just joking back. His eyes widened. So you never really dated him? She'd married a man that she'd had no real feelings for. No wonder she felt like there was something wrong with her sexually. He had probably looked at her like a sister, too. She shook her head. I really thought he was just kidding. Well, when I got home from student teaching the next day, my mom had called and was so excited and was talking about reserving the church for the wedding. I told her I'd call her back, and I called Jake. He came over. She studied their entwined fingers. I honestly don't know how he convinced me. I was a virgin, and he wasn't, and he kept telling me that sex was the least important part of marriage. That being friends was the most important thing. And I kept thinking that the moms were going to be so upset when they found out the truth. And, well, before he left my apartment, we were engaged for real. Nick stared at her in disbelief. So you were married to your best friend who you had absolutely no feelings for other than friendship? He was beginning to understand how she had gotten such a complex about her sexuality. Yeah. If you could call it a marriage. It was more of a roommate situation where we had sex on very rare occasions. I can promise you that marriage to me would be very different from that. He would have her under him, or over him, or in any position she wanted all the time. She turned to look at him for the first time since they'd started this conversation. You mean we wouldn't have sex even on rare occasions? She asked, not sure if she was joking or not. He laughed. I promise you, we'd have it, and it would not be on rare occasions. It would be on every possible occasion. In fact, let me see if I can find a babysitter tonight, and I'll show you what I mean. She stared into his eyes. You really aren't totally turned off by that? You don't think that I must have been lousy in bed, or he would have discovered that he was interested in me after we were married and in bed together? You were practically his sister. If he'd had feelings for you, I'd have been surprised. He stroked her cheek with one finger. I don't think of you as a sister at all. I sure wish you'd let me demonstrate. His eyes really sucked her in. They were like huge pools of chocolate, and she'd always been a chocolate lover. I really can't. I know it's stupid, but I can't. I'd feel like I was betraying his memory or some such nonsense. I know that's dumb, but we never slept together without marriage, and I don't think I should sleep with you without it either. She turned back to the boys to make sure they were still playing and okay. In the water, she was half afraid to turn away from them even for a second. So when do you want to get married? He asked. He waited for her to sputter. He knew she would, but he had to say it. She turned and stared at him. I think we need to get to know one another a bit better first. He had to be kidding. He was kidding, wasn't he? He sighed. How did I know you'd say something like that? He watched her face carefully for some sign of response. What do you want to know? What happened to Connor's mom? The question had been burning in her mind since they'd met, and even more so since he'd avoided the topic the one time she'd questioned him about it. I guess if you told me about your marriage, I should tell you about Melissa. He paused, making her think that there was nothing that he wanted to talk about less than Melissa. Melissa was the most self-centered human being I have ever met in my life. I just didn't know it at the time. I met her at an office party. She was there with a friend of hers, one of my employees. She nodded. Was she pretty? He laughed. You know? I thought so at first, but she was one of those people who are pretty for the 3 days it takes you to get to know them. Anyway, I drank a little too much at that party, and took her home with me. She left the next morning, and I thought I'd never see her again. That was fine with me. She came back 2 months later and told me she was pregnant. She wanted money for an abortion. Samantha looked out at Connor playing with Luke. I'm guessing you didn't give it to her? He shook his head. Instead, I let her move in with me, and paid all her expenses for 9 months. She lived there until Connor was 2 months old and she was fully recovered from childbirth. Then she left. I paid her off. I pretty much purchased my son from the scheming bitch. I found out later that she routinely hooked up with men and got pregnant and then milked them for abortion costs. Usually 10 times the actual cost. It's how she supported herself. Samantha shook her head. Wow. That's worse than my Jake story. What does Connor know about her? Nothing. And we're going to keep it that way. He knows that his biological mom went away when he was a baby. That's it. He's been my whole life since I found out she was pregnant. I've gone out a couple of times since he was born, but I really don't date much. That's crazy. Do you know how many women would be happy to be Connor's mom? Well, maybe not Connor's mom, but sexy Nick's wife. Are you interested in applying for the position? She sighed. Why don't we find a sitter and go out, just the 2 of us, and see how we get along? I'm not saying I'll sleep with you. I just want to get to know you better, and we'll see where we should go from here. Do you have a sitter you use? She shook her head. Not really. I've always taken Luke everywhere with me. I leave him with another kindergarten teacher at my school when I have a doctor's appointment, but that's it. He looked at her. Well, you're my babysitter. Why don't you give her a call and see if she can watch them? When? Tonight? Why wait? He stroked his hand down her arm. I really want you in my life. We need to see if we're as compatible as I think we are. Maybe if they went out tonight, he could talk her into marrying him by next week. Just because I'm agreeing to go out with you, doesn't mean I'm agreeing to sex. You know that, right? She needed to put her cards on the table and make sure that he knew where he stood. She'd spend time with him, but she wouldn't sleep with him. Not yet, anyway. He nodded. I know. I'm not agreeing to not try to change your mind, though. She shook her head. You're crazy. Maybe. I never denied that. Go call your friend. He gave her a gentle nudge toward her bag, and went into the water to play with the boys. She walked to her bag and dug for her cell phone. She used the speed dial to call her friend, Jessica. Jess? Hey, it's Sam. Do you have plans tonight? Jessica laughed. You know that my life is hopelessly boring. What do you want to do? Are you wanting to go out and find a man? Go shopping? Play Parcheesi? I'll bring Monopoly and we can play with the kid. Anything. Get me out of my apartment. Samantha laughed. Actually, I have a favor to ask. If it means I get to do something other than sit alone in my apartment on a Saturday night, I'm all for it. What? I have a date. Could you watch a couple of little boys for me? A couple of boys? Luke and? Wait. Don't tell me. You finally agreed to go out with Connor's dad. That man is hot. Yeah, I'll watch Luke and Connor for you. What time? Your place? Samantha grinned. Her friend knew her so well. Yeah, it's Luke and Connor. Just a second. She covered the receiver. What time do we need to leave my place? She called to Nick in the pool. 7 should be good. 7? I doubt if we'll be out past 10 or so, she said. Okay. Sounds good to me. I can entertain the monster duo. Thanks, Jessica. I really appreciate it. No problem. I'll see you at 7. She pushed the end button and put her phone back in her bag, going to sit back on the steps. Nick swam back over to her with his powerful strokes. She loved watching him swim. Of course, she'd have loved watching him do anything that involved him not wearing a shirt. Is everything set? Yeah. She'll be there at 7. I told her we'd be back by about 10. She wanted that stated clearly so he could plan the night with that in mind. She's going to watch them at your place, he asked. Yeah. I thought that would be easiest, since she already knows where it is. That works for me. Chapter 3. The rest of the day flew by. Nick dropped her and Luke back at her house at 5, so she could get showered and ready for their date. Luke was upset about having to leave his friend, but was pacified by the idea of having an evening with Connor coming over and having Miss Jessica watch them. It had been so long since Samantha had been on a date she was unsure what to wear. She debated between a skirt and slacks for a while, but finally decided on a slim skirt that ended just above her knee, and a green silk tank top that she knew matched her eyes. She added just a touch of makeup and let her hair hang loose. When she walked out into the living room about 15 minutes before 7, Luke looked up at her and said, "Wow, Mom. You look like a girl." She laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." She gave him a quick hug. "Now I want you to be on your best behavior tonight. You need to obey Miss Jessica the first time. No matter what. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am. I know you and Connor are going to have a good time, but try and include her. She'd probably like to play a game or something. She likes Monopoly." Luke's eyes grew big. He'd just learned Monopoly and loved to find someone to play with. Really? Do you think she'd play? I think she would. The doorbell rang then, and she went to get it, while Luke ran to get the Monopoly game from the game closet. "Hey, Jessica." Samantha hugged her friend. "I really appreciate you doing this at the last minute." "No problem. I came early so you could tell me everything. Are you guys sleeping together yet?" Jessica was a tiny little curvy redhead. She had been Samantha's student teacher while she was pregnant with Luke, and they'd been instant friends. On the day Jessica had first come into the classroom, she'd held out her hand to introduce herself, and Samantha had instantly turned green and run for the restroom. When she returned, Jessica had asked if her deodorant had failed. They'd both laughed, and had been friends ever since. "No, we're not. This is our first no-kid date. I'm really nervous. Do I look okay? Jessica rolled her eyes. You always look fabulous. What made you finally decide to go out with him? Jessica knew about her horrible marriage, but she was the only one who did, so Samantha knew she could be blunt. He asked to take Luke and I both out, and I finally caved. After we got back, I told him it was just that once, and he kissed me. That one kiss, and I'm his slave for life. That man can kiss. Jessica grinned. Oh, you're getting to the good stuff. Plus, that's it. We spent the day together at his house swimming, and then decided to see if you could sit tonight. He asked me to marry him. Well, kind of. He said we need to get married and asked me how soon I was willing to marry him, which isn't exactly asking. Jessica's whole face lit up. You know, I've thought you should date him for months and months. I think he's perfect for you, Sam. Just give him a chance. I will. Luke raced back into the room with the Monopoly game. I told Luke that you like Monopoly. The boys haven't eaten yet, but there's plenty of quick-fix stuff here. Just dig and fix whatever. Or you can order a pizza or Chinese if you prefer. I don't care. I'll leave money on the counter so you can order pizza if you want. Jessica shrugged. I think pizza could be fun with my boys. Is there a bedtime? Nah. We'll be back by about 10, and they can stay up that late on the weekend. They may pass out on you, but you don't need to worry about putting them to bed. The bell rang again. She opened the door to Nick and Connor. Connor raced inside to Luke and they hugged as if they hadn't seen each other in weeks. Immediately they ran into the yard to play. Nick waited until the back door closed behind them before kissing Samantha briefly. He held his hand out to Jessica. Hi, I'm Nick. Jessica smiled. Yeah, I've seen you up at the school once or twice. I'm Jessica. I'm one of the other kindergarten teachers. It's nice to meet you. Anything I need to know about Connor? No food allergies or anything? Nope, he's healthy as a horse. Did Samantha talk to you about dinner for them? I hadn't thought about that. He hadn't thought about anything but finally having Samantha alone and all to himself. No little boys with prying eyes. Samantha nodded. Of course, I did. I'm leaving some money on the counter, and they're going to order pizza. He pulled out his wallet. No, I'm leaving money. He put a couple of 20s on the counter and walked to the door with Samantha. You have her cell phone number if you need to reach us, right? Sure do. Y'all have fun. Jessica closed the door behind them. She seems nice, Nick told her. Jess is great. She was my student teacher before she started teaching there. We've been friends since I was pregnant with Luke, she said. So you trust her? He wasn't overly nervous. He didn't leave Connor with a lot of people, but he trusted Samantha implicitly. Absolutely. The boys will have a blast and beg us to let them do this again soon. I promise. There was no doubt in her mind that all three of them would have a blast. Jessica was always excited once school was out, but she was not the bar type, and shy about meeting new people. She tended to be bored by the end of June. They got in his truck and he started driving. Where are we going? She asked. A little out of the way place I know about. They serve the best steak in Texas. She smiled. Sounds good to me. I'm glad you told me about your marriage today. I know you had to trust me a lot to do that, and I really appreciate it. I thought it would scare you off. I seriously didn't think I'd ever see you again after telling you all that. Well, you're seeing me again. I think you made a big mistake when you married him, but we've all made mistakes. You stuck with him, which was good. How did he die? Car wreck. She still remembered the shock she'd felt when the policeman had shown up at her door. Sure, she and Jake hadn't had a normal relationship, but she'd lost her best friend and the father of her child that day. She still mourned him. It was raining and a driver cut him off. He swerved to avoid them and ended up crashing into a bridge support. I'm sorry. I'm sure that was really hard for you. He paused for a moment as he thought about how rough it would have been for her. No matter how bad their marriage had been, he had been her best friend. How was he with Luke? Really good. He loved Luke. He was just not much of a husband. We got along great, but sex was just not something that happened. We had sex about once a month at the beginning of our marriage, and it went downhill from there. I'm really surprised I got pregnant. I timed it really well, and it worked, but we never had sex again after I got pregnant. He looked over at her, taking his eyes off the road for a second. So you haven't had sex in 7 years? Nope. And to be honest, I never enjoyed it when I did have it. She felt like she needed to get that out there. If he thought that she was dying to have sex with him, he was wrong. She wasn't dying to have sex with anyone. She was more interested in sex with him than she'd ever been with anyone else, but she still was pretty sure she wouldn't enjoy it. He nodded. I got that impression. Did you always feel like you were doing your brother? She laughed. Well, I wouldn't put it that way, because I don't have a brother, but that's probably as close to true as you could get. He pulled into the parking lot of a small restaurant. Don't worry, honey. It won't feel that way with me. And I'll make good and sure that you enjoy it. She stared at him. You know, I'm half afraid that if we did make love, you'd feel the same way that Jake did. That it just wasn't worth the time. She looked down at her hands after saying that. She was embarrassed to have admitted it. He reached across and unbuckled her seatbelt and pulled her across the seat to him. We can skip dinner and go back to my place, and I'll show you that's not true. His lips spoke against her ear, and then trailed down to her throat where he placed soft wet kisses. She felt a shot of fire shoot straight through her core. We need to eat dinner. I'm not ready for this. He made her feel ready, but she was sure that once it happened, their relationship would be over. He took a deep breath. Okay, let's eat. They got out of the truck and walked into the restaurant. Once they were seated and had given their drink orders, he took her hand in his. Have I told you how beautiful you look tonight? She smiled at him. Thank you. She was startled by the compliment, but pleased as well. She wasn't used to being complimented at all, but she'd taken special care dressing and was pleased that he'd noticed. They placed their orders and talked softly throughout their meal. She was pleased to discover that they liked the same music and both enjoyed some of the same movies. They talked about the kids and the trials of being single parents. He tried repeatedly to bring up the topic of marriage to her. Finally, after his 4th attempt to talk about marriage, she asked, what would happen if we got married, and you discovered I really was as lousy in bed as Jake thought I was? Would you leave? Would that be the end of our relationship? Then what would happen to 2 little boys who would have been so thrilled to become brothers? To Luke, who would have finally had a dad? To Connor, who would have been ecstatic to have a mother? He shook his head at her. You really think that would happen, don't you? Look, if we didn't enjoy sex together the first time, then we'd figure it out. We have so much passion between us that we'd figure it out. Fast. I cannot imagine either of us not enjoying it, but if it happened, we would keep going. She stared at him. So you wouldn't give up after just once? Is that what Jake did? He watched her closely, trying to gauge her reaction. There was still something she wasn't telling him, and he wouldn't be able to get through to her until he knew what it was. She shrugged. Tell me about your wedding night. She shook her head. Please. That must be it. If he could get her to open up about it, maybe he could convince her. He'd never in his life wanted a woman so much. He wanted her for not just a night, though. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. He wanted her face on the pillow next to his every morning. She took a deep breath. I had a really pretty little white teddy that I'd bought. He barely noticed me when I came into the room wearing it. When I got into bed and asked if he was going to join me, I thought he was going to laugh. It was so obvious, he was fighting back laughter. I asked him what was funny. She looked down at her hands, which were shredding a napkin. What did he say? He couldn't imagine laughing at her in sexy lingerie. He couldn't imagine letting her wear it for more than 10 seconds. He said that I looked like a little girl trying to play dress up in my mom's clothes. That I shouldn't even try to wear stuff like that. Did you make love that night? He was almost afraid of the answer, but he had to know what they were up against. She nodded. Kind of. What does that mean? Well, we had sex. I wouldn't call it lovemaking. He kissed me, rolled on top of me, and it was over. Then he told me that it would take him about a month to recover enough to want to do that again. She shrugged. My sex life sucked. It sounds like it. Let me tell you how sex with me would be. You would walk into the room wearing that sexy teddy you mentioned. My jaw would drop and I'd start salivating. I'd pick you up and carry you to the bed. I'd lay you down and start kissing you. My hands would be all over you, your breasts, your arms, your stomach, your legs. I'd touch you everywhere until I was sure you were as ready for me as I was for you. And then I'd move between your thighs, and I'd make sweet love to you. She smiled. I can picture that. Even his words made her hot. How did he do that to her? How could he make her feel with just words things that other boys hadn't been able to make her feel with hour-long make-out sessions? Do you like that idea? Please let her like that idea. She nodded. I think I'm ready now just at your description. The whole thought of that really turned her on. What was it about this man? Why not others? Why not Jake? Call Jessica. We'll go back to my place. She shook her head. I can't do that. My marriage wasn't great, but he was still my best friend. He was my best friend from the time I could walk, and I can't betray him that way. Marry me then. It was what he wanted anyway. She stared into his eyes. You're really serious, aren't you? I'm really serious. I know you'd make a great mother to my son. I'll make a great father to yours. I want to have more children that are ours. I want to spend my days laughing with you and our children. I want to spend my nights making love with you. Marry me. Could she? Could she trust that this man would not hurt her like Jake had? Could she trust that he would be kind and loving? Yes. She thought she could. Okay. Really? His whole face lit up at the word. She nodded. Really? She may be making another huge mistake, but she really wanted to marry him. She wanted to be his wife. She wanted him to be Luke's father. When? She thought about that. August? That would give her time to plan a wedding. Not that she wanted another big wedding, but it was what she should do. He looked appalled. It's only June. I was thinking more like Thursday. He couldn't wait 2 months to sleep with her. If she was dead set on holding out for the wedding, then he was dead set on having the wedding fast. Thursday? Are you serious? Her mind was racing. Could she be ready to marry him on Thursday? There was so much to do for a wedding. I've been married before. It takes a lot longer than that to plan even a simple ceremony. I could take the week off work. We'll get the marriage license Monday. 3-day waiting period in Texas. We can get married on Thursday. Would Jessica keep the kids for a couple of days for us while we honeymoon? I'm sure she would. Are you sure you want to do it that quickly? I mean, won't your family want to be there? She liked the idea of a quick ceremony with no one there. She loved the idea. A wedding should be private. Probably. I don't particularly want a big wedding though. It sounds like you've been there and done that. Do you want to go through all that again? I didn't want to do all of that the first time. Was he serious? Let's do it then. We'll tell everyone afterward. The kids and Jessica will be thrilled and they can be there for it. We don't need anyone else. She couldn't believe she was actually considering something so crazy, but she really didn't want another big wedding. Both of the moms would be upset because she was leaving Jake's memory behind. They thought she'd had the perfect marriage. She wasn't about to disillusion them now. Okay, Thursday it is. He paid the check and they walked out to the truck. As soon as they were in the parking lot, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. There, now that we've had an engagement kiss, you can't back out. She laughed. You can't either then. I wouldn't. I'm not the skittish one. The boys were almost asleep when they got back. He insisted on paying Jessica before herding Connor out to the truck. He kissed Samantha quickly and said, "We'll drop by tomorrow." Samantha looked at Jessica and said, "Wait here while I put Luke to bed." She helped Luke with his bedtime ritual and got him tucked in, and went back to her friend. The two of them sat together on the couch while she told her everything. Jessica immediately agreed to watch the boys Monday while they got their marriage license and again from Thursday through Sunday while they were off on a short honeymoon. I can't believe you actually agreed to marry him. I'm so happy for you. Jessica was so excited her voice was squeaky. She hugged Samantha. I appreciate you helping out so much. I'm sure the boys could go stay with the moms while we're gone, but I don't want to involve them until after the wedding. They'd insist on a big ceremony, and I've done that. It didn't turn out well for me. She didn't need to say more than that. Jessica would understand. Jessica nodded. I know. I think you're making the best decision. She stood to go. Call me tomorrow and let me know what time you want me back here on Monday. Samantha stifled a yawn. I will. I wonder what he has planned for tomorrow. He seems determined to show me that Luke and I need him and Connor to have a family. Jessica smiled. You do need him. I've never seen you look so happy. Samantha locked the door after her friend and brushed her teeth. She was just climbing into bed when she heard the phone ring. She picked up the phone and took it into bed with her. Hello? I just wanted to tell you that I miss you. She loved hearing his voice just as she was getting into bed. You're crazy, Nick. I can't wait until I have the right to stay with you all night every night. Just a few more days, you know. She smiled. I know. She couldn't wait. Dream of me. I will. She thought to herself, but didn't add, I always do. Chapter 4. Sunday was typically a lounge-around-the-house day for Samantha and Luke. She and Nick had decided the night before that they would wait until the four of them were all together to talk about their pending marriage. She knew the boys would be happy about it, but she thought it would be best if they told them together. She really didn't expect Nick and Connor to show up until afternoon, so they were still in their pajamas in the living room when the doorbell rang at 10. Luke had been watching TV and Samantha had been curled up on the couch reading a book. Luke ran to the door and opened it wide. She looked down at her pajamas. She wasn't indecent, but she wasn't exactly dressed for company. The pants were capris, but extremely thin, and the top was a tank and she was wearing no bra. She thought about running for her bedroom, but decided to stand her ground. Luke hadn't realized that Connor and Nick were coming over today and got excited, grabbing Connor and running outside to play, not bothering to put any clothes on. Samantha shrugged. It was okay to play in the backyard in his pajamas. Nick sat down on the couch next to her. "Good morning," he whispered softly. She turned her face up to his for a kiss. "Morning. Have I mentioned before how much I love your jammies?" She laughed. "When I realized you were here, I almost ran from my bedroom to dress, but decided that would seem too cowardly." He grinned. "It would have. Besides, you have nothing that I don't plan on seeing without any covering at all in less than a week." She blushed, but nodded. "That's kind of what I figured. I should go get dressed though. I figured you'd call before you came over." He looked really good this morning. He was wearing a pair of shorts and a blue t-shirt. For whatever reason, the navy in the shirt brought out the brown in his eyes. She did love his eyes. "I thought it might be more fun to surprise you." I was right. His hand skimmed over the front of her tank top across the side of her breast. She flushed, but didn't push his hand away. She glanced out the window quickly to make sure the boys were occupied on the swings and turned to him more fully, moving closer into his embrace. Her fingers skimmed the side of his neck. "So, when will you know if you can get off work tomorrow?" He smiled. "I'm the CEO, honey. I can get off work whenever I feel like it. I called my assistant this morning and let her know I'd be off for the week. I told her I was getting married and I wasn't to be bothered unless there was a corporate takeover, and then she'd better think twice about calling first. So what time will we be leaving to go and get the marriage license?" She nuzzled his neck as she asked the question. He wound his fingers through her hair, playing with the strands. "I was thinking we'd leave here about 9. We can get the license and then grab lunch, just the two of us. I also want you to meet my housekeeper. She's there 3 days a week, and I'm hoping you two will get along. She's been there since Connor was born. She started out as his nanny and my housekeeper, but as he got older, he was just too much for her. That's when I found you." His hands roamed over her back. "I'm so glad I found you." She bit his neck gently. "I am, too. It's kind of scary, but exciting all at the same time. You know?" He slid his hand under the back of her tank top, rubbing her bare skin. "Why is it scary?" She moved even closer to him, not realizing that she'd all but climbed on his lap. She would have been horrified if she could have seen herself. "Well, it's exciting physically. I mean, I've never felt like this before. With all of the different guys I dated in high school and college, I never really got turned on when they kissed me. Does that make sense? When you kiss me, I feel like my heart is going to explode out of my chest. But that's scary, too, because it gives you a power over me that no one's ever had." Her lips were at his ear, and she was nibbling at it gently. Her hands were under his shirt, roaming across the muscles of his back and shoulders. He was pretty sure that she didn't even realize that she was touching him like that. "I can understand that. I promise that I won't hurt you. I really care about you, Samantha." She smiled and pulled back to look into his eyes. "Have I ever told you how much I love your eyes? They're the exact color of chocolate. I love chocolate." She leaned forward and brushed her lips against his. The back door slammed open and she flew back away from him. Luke ran in and asked, "Hey Mom, what are we doing today? Why is Connor here?" Samantha turned to her son, shaking her head to clear the cobwebs. "Well, Mr. Nick and I want to talk to you too about something." She looked at Nick for support. "Yeah, go get Connor. We'll go ahead and have that talk now." Luke ran back out the door, and came back a second later with Connor in tow. "I'm only asking because we were hoping we could do something cool, like maybe go play miniature golf or something." Nick's lips jerked up at that. "I think that sounds like a lot of fun. Let's talk first, and then we'll figure out something to do today." He took a deep breath and reached out and took Samantha's hand in his. We've decided that we're going to get married. Luke and Connor looked at each other for a second and then they both let out squeals of joy. We're going to be brothers. Luke yelled. Woohoo! Connor cried. They hugged each other tight, and then they piled on the couch on top of the adults. When do we get married? Luke asked. Samantha grinned at his choice of words. Well, we were thinking we'd get married on Thursday. Luke thought for a minute. Today is stay in our jammies day, so it's Sunday. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. 3 days. We'll be brothers in 3 days. You forgot Wednesday. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Luke nodded. 4 days. Can we live in their house, Mom? It's bigger, and they have a pool. Nick laughed. I think we'll need to. Do you think you can help your mom get your stuff packed up to move it to our house? He grinned at Samantha as he asked. I know I can. I'll help too, Connor chimed in. I'll help while I'm here this week. Nick smiled. We'll all help. I'm taking the whole week off work. We're going to ask Miss Jessica to watch y'all again tomorrow because we need to go and get a marriage license. Would you like that? The boys got even more unruly at that piece of news. We love Miss Jessica. Connor squealed. Samantha smiled watching Nick with both boys. He put his hands up to calm them and then said, and we're going to ask if she'll keep you for several days. We're going on a honeymoon. Luke tilted his head to the side and looked at Nick. What's a honeymoon and where are we going? Nick grinned. A honeymoon is a vacation you go on when you first get married to spend time alone together. Y'all are going to stay with Miss Jessica, and I'm going to take your mom on a honeymoon. You're going on vacation without us? That's not fair. Luke looked belligerent. Nick's voice became firm. It is fair. Y'all will have a lot of fun with Miss Jessica. You can swim every day and do lots of fun stuff. We'll be gone for 3 days. Then, when we come back, we'll be a family. Luke looked like he was about to argue, but the look on Nick's face made him stop. I guess that'll be okay. Jessica has already agreed to watch you guys for the honeymoon and tomorrow. I just need to call her and tell her what time. Let me run and do that now. I'm also going to shower and get dressed, and then we'll decide what to do today. She left Nick with both boys and called Jessica and showered. When she got back into the living room, they were nowhere to be found. She looked through the house and finally found them in the backyard. Nick was taking turns pushing them on the swings. Both boys were squealing. She wanted to shout that he was pushing them too high, but by their happy shouts, she knew that they weren't frightened. She couldn't help but smile as she leaned against the door watching them. Luke needed a father figure in his life so badly. Jake truly hadn't been a bad father to him, and he'd missed his daddy at first, but now he had no memories of him. He had pictures that he looked at and said he missed his daddy, but he had no real memories of him, which was sad. After watching for a few minutes, she opened the back door and walked out to join them. The wave of heat that greeted her almost stopped her, but she kept going. She was a Texas girl born and bred, but this summer the heat had been too much even for her. No one noticed as she approached the swings and leaned against one of the legs of the wooden jungle gym she and Jake had purchased for Luke's 3rd birthday. She couldn't count the number of hours that Luke and Connor had spent on it in the past year. It held a lot of memories. She was sad to leave it, and the house. Luke had taken his first steps there. So, what did y'all decide to do today? She asked. Nick looked over at her with a smile. We decided to go and get some boxes and have a moving party. We're going to order a pizza and start packing up your house. Doesn't that sound like fun? She gave him a startled look. Oh, that sounds like oodles of fun. Who came up with that great idea? Nick nodded to the boys. They did. I was telling them how I wished it was done so we could go to Six Flags, and how we could only go while I was off work this week if we got it done fast, so they said we should work on it today, so that we could maybe go to Six Flags on Wednesday. That really is a great idea. Thanks so much for being willing to work on a Sunday, boys. It means a lot to me. Luke was still wearing his Phineas and Ferb pajamas, so she sent him into the house to change into some clothes. Are we all going to get boxes, or just you and the boys? Because I could stay here and get the pizza ordered, and start going through things to pack while you got boxes. He sighed. Getting boxes is a manly thing. We didn't want you to go anyway. Did we, Connor? Connor shook his head. She was always amazed at how much Connor looked like his dad. He was going to be a lady killer someday. Nope. We didn't. Only men do men's work. Connor jumped down off the swing, and they all went into the house. The boys left as soon as Luke was dressed, and she put in the order for the pizzas. She started going through her kitchen cabinets looking for things that weren't used often that she could either sell or pack up now. She knew she'd need to get rid of a lot of things, because Nick would have most of what she needed at his house already. She'd made a mental note to ask Nick to take her by the house tomorrow while they were out so she could take inventory of his kitchen. She needed to have an idea of what things she should keep and what she shouldn't. The pizza and boxes arrived at the same time, and they all worked and had fun as they packed up the house. By the end of the day, she was beat. I hate moving, she grumbled as the boys went outside at the end of the day. Nick pulled her into his arms and held her against him. He didn't try to kiss her, but just held her. I'm sorry. Hopefully this will be the last move you ever make. She nodded against his shoulder. I don't know that we're going to need any of my furniture at all. Maybe Luke's bedroom set. Everything else is going to need to be sold. I guess I can do that online. Yeah, that's probably best. We'll take pictures of everything tomorrow after we get back from getting our marriage license. We're going to have a really busy week. I know. It'll be worth it in the end though. It would be worth it to have a father for Luke, and the companionship for her. And she was sure willing to give the sex thing another try with Nick. But only with Nick. He smiled. I sure think so. He dipped his head and kissed her softly. We need to get home. I'll see you in the morning. Okay. They called the boys in, and she walked them to the door. Nick gave her a quick kiss goodbye, and they both ignored the retching sounds coming from the boys. They were just going to have to get used to kissing. She planned on doing a whole lot of it. She received another phone call just before bed that night. This was becoming a habit, but one that she liked. His deep voice wishing her good night was once again the last thing she heard. Her dreams had never been sweeter.